Forecast Pro XE is very focused on generating statistical forecasts. This is really its primary purpose. We sometimes refer to it as a desktop analysis tool. It's the kind of thing it's very easy to pick up and use, and when you need to generate some forecasts, it's there for you. It assumes that we're going to be working reasonably carefully with each item that we're forecasting, and so it's designed for modest amounts of data. You can forecast up to 100 items at a time, but it allows you to go into more depth. So if you wanted to do custom modeling, if you're well-versed in forecasting methodology and you want to look at advanced diagnostics, it offers a great deal in that regard, and we're going to see that in just a minute. It's also the only version of Forecast Pro that offers dynamic regression. So if regression modeling is something that's important to you, it is in Forecast Pro XE. So what are the main product capabilities of Forecast Pro XE? Well, again, its primary purpose to generate accurate, statistically based forecasts. We're going to be building forecasts based upon past demand history for the items that we want to forecast, and potentially other information, things like promotional schedules, explanatory variables, etc. It can build a forecast automatically. It has something we call expert selection, which is sort of like an automatic pilot. If you give us the demand history, expert selection can analyze the data, choose an appropriate forecasting method, and build the forecast. So we're going to see this again in action in just a second. If you want to go beyond expert selection and automatic forecasting, there's a whole array of different forecasting methods that are implemented, and these include advanced methods such as promotional modeling. We use something called event modeling, dealing with multiple level hierarchies. So if I've got different ways to organize my data, and we can view it and forecast it. There's new product forecasting methods, and as I mentioned before, there's also dynamic regression. So lots and lots of forecasting capabilities. Here's a roadmap of how we're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so. I'm going to start with an example of what you might call basic operations, show you how a typical forecasting session works, and it will focus on expert selection. After we've done that, we'll take a look at some custom modeling options, and we'll see that it's very easy to change our models if we desire. And then we'll look at dealing with a product hierarchy and regression. And as Eric mentioned, we'll be pausing at various points throughout the presentation and field some questions as they come in. So be sure if you do have questions, go ahead and enter them using your chat facility. So without further ado, actually, and without the benefit of that slide, I'm going to go ahead and start Forecast Pro, and let's show you around a little bit. So this is Forecast Pro XE. It's a fairly standard Windows-style interface. There are drop-down menus across the top. There's a toolbar with icons for the most commonly performed operations. Basically, when you use Forecast Pro, one thing you're going to need to do is to bring data in. And the data can come from a variety of sources. Very often our users are bringing in data from a spreadsheet. So again, the input to Forecast Pro will be the demand history for the items you want to forecast. It can come in a variety of ways. Spreadsheets are common. We can also bring it in through text files, through CSV files. We can bring it in using something called ODBC, which is a way of reading and writing to relational databases. So if your data currently reside in Access or SQL Server, we could read directly from there. Although I'd say the majority of Forecast Pro XE users are working with Excel, and for our example, we're going to work with Excel as well. So the first step is to actually tell the Forecast Pro what data we want to use. And I click on a button there. This is our script icon, and it's prompting me to read in some data. So that makes some sense. Let's do that. I'm going to start by selecting a data set. It's an Excel spreadsheet called Cameras. I'll go ahead and open it up. And this will place me into what we call the script dialog box. So this box allows me to specify what variables or items I want to forecast. And in this very simple example, I have two different items on my spreadsheet. iCamera is an instant developing camera. So it's one of those cameras where you take the picture, The film spits out of one end of the camera, you wait 60 seconds and pull it apart, and you have a fully developed photo. The other is a variable format camera, which is also sold by the same company. All the data I'm going to show you today is real data. It all comes from Forecast Pro clients. So I'm going to go ahead and select these items. I'm just double-clicking on them, and it puts them onto our script. And I'm now going to click the OK button. And when I do, Forecast Pro is going to do a bunch of stuff. So let's watch what it does. It read in the data, and it actually generated a forecast. So you'll notice there's a graph that's shown. The green line on the graph is the history. This came out of the spreadsheet. So this is monthly sales for our instant camera. It looks like we've got, I don't know, about 4 years worth of historic demand data. And it read this in from the spreadsheet, and it generated the red line. The red line is our forecast. So it automatically generated a forecast for us, and the blue lines are what we call confidence limits, so the spread around the forecast. But the main thing I want to point out is just by listing what I wanted to forecast on my script and clicking OK, it's gone ahead and generated a forecast. The other item over here, we call this the navigator. If I click on the variable format camera, I'll move to that. You'll notice it also has a graph showing the history and the forecast. And as I move around the navigator, it will update all displays. And in this very simple example, we are only forecasting 2 items, 2 different types of cameras. Now, so the top half is a graph. The bottom half is a report. And we're actually on what we call the report window at the moment. There are other windows that will open later. But the report at the bottom tells us some things about how the data were forecasted. So in this example, because we have not specified any special instructions on how to generate the forecast, both of our items were forecasted using expert selection. Notice that this section of the report is labeled Expert Analysis, and this section tells us the logic behind the selection of the forecasting method. Basically, the way this works is sort of a two-pronged approach, if you will. The Forecast Pro will go look at the historic demand history and run it through a series of rule-based logic tests. So there's about a couple hundred tests built into the software, and at times these tests will narrow down the appropriate forecasting methods, and at times they may even confirm a method. But phase 1 is to analyze the data and run it through a set of rules. So for instance, a rule might be, if I have less than 24 months of history, we're not going to consider seasonal Box-Jenkins models. So that's an example of a rule that narrows down the forecasting methods that we might consider. So let's read this analysis here. It says, using rule-based logic, I have narrowed down the choice to exponential smoothing or Box-Jenkins. So for this particular data set, both exponential smoothing and Box-Jenkins could be used. They would both yield very reasonable forecasts, but we need to choose one of them. So it says, I will perform an out-of-sample test to select between these 2 approaches. Basically, an out-of-sample test says, we have 4 years worth of data, let's not use it all. Let's chop off the data. So say that we chop the last 6 months of the data off, and we use the data starting here and ending here to forecast the remaining 6 months. So it's kind of like saying, what if you generated a forecast 6 months ago? How accurate would those forecasts have been? And we do that using both of the methods that we're trying to choose between, in this case, exponential smoothing and Box-Jenkins. So that's the second part of the expert selection, and I'll read the results here. The cumulative MAD. MAD stands for mean absolute deviation, but just think of it as the unit error. So the unit error for exponential smoothing was 1,378. The unit error for Box-Jenkins was 2,450. The rolling out of sample test used a maximum horizon of 6 and generated 21 forecasts for each method. It actually uses something called a rolling-based forecast, but the gist of it is we withheld some data, we tried both methods, and exponential smoothing yielded a lower error. So if we had been forecasting 6 months ago, we would have been better off to use exponential smoothing as opposed to Box-Jenkins. So based on that lower MAD, I will use exponential smoothing. So the program sometimes talks to you in the first person, and it's saying, for this expert selection analysis, we've decided to use exponential smoothing. Now, I'm going to scroll down a little further, and at this point, the program takes all the data, and it generates the forecast that's on the screen. Forecast Pro is not a black box. It is always going to show you the model details. So in this case, we built an exponential smoothing model. It happened to be a model that's not trended, but is seasonal. And I think from the green line, you can sort of see that. It's really not trended, but there certainly is a distinctive seasonal pattern. So we captured that. All of the details of the model, all of the numbers that go in the equations are shown. So that if we want to document exactly how the forecasts were generated, we can do so. Here's another section of the report, within sample statistics. These are statistics that measure how well we fit the data. So some of these should be familiar, things like the R-squared, the MAPE, which is the percentage error, the MAD, which, as I mentioned before, is the unit error. But all of these are within sample statistics. They're used to help compare and contrast different models. Because we're using expert selection, we were probably not going to pay a whole lot of attention to within sample statistics, but again, if we want to view them, they are here, and when we do custom modeling, they can be quite important. Probably the most interesting part of the report is the forecasts themselves. So here they are numerically. They're shown with quarterly and annual totals, along with their confidence limits. At the bottom, we've got some summary statistics, the total for the forecast, the average, the minimum, the maximum. But again, we can view the forecast both numerically and graphically on this report. So the report is flexible. It documents how the forecasts were generated. Every item we forecast, if we click on it on the navigator, we'll have a report and a graph. And the other thing about these reports, and the graphs for that matter, is they're fully customizable. So I'm going to open up what we call a curtain menu. I'm going to click on that word display up here, and that pulls down this little curtain menu. And it gives me some options about reports. I currently have it set on the default, what's called the standard report. But let's say I'm creating a report and I want to give it to my manager, and he or she is really not interested in anything but the forecast. So I'm going to do a report style that says forecasts only. And now, rather than having all that information about the model and expert selection, all it's going to give me are the actual forecasts on my report. So it's a much, much simpler report. In addition to the forecast-only reports, we have a basic one, which includes a little more information, but not as much as the standard report. We have a complete report. This says, tell me everything that Forecast Pro knows about this. So it has all the sections that we saw before, but in addition to that, there are things like some pretty advanced diagnostics. So there's a larger set of within sample statistics. There's a section on the history where we show the fitted values, for instance. There is a section after the forecast data on safety stack analysis. So it's showing things like the demand during lead times and reorder points. But the idea that I'm trying to get across here is I can customize this, and there are some standardized reports that are built in. There's also the idea of choosing a custom report and completely dictating what goes in. What sections do we want to include? What do we want those sections to contain? So for instance, let's click on one of these tabs, within sample statistics. Here's a complete list of all the ones we can show, and you can have checkboxes to determine which ones you want to include, along with the precision. How many decimal places do we want when we show this stuff? So each section of the report can be highly customized. And you can basically generate a custom report to show just the information you want to see. So you can completely customize it for your needs. Now, in addition to the report being able to customize the report, I'm going to put this back on the standard report. You can also customize the graph. So we have a very basic graph at the moment, but maybe I want to jazz it up a little bit. So I'm going to go under this graph components, and one of the things I could do, for instance, is I can add things to the graph. Let's say I want to look at the fitted values. So now I've got this red line that shows me how we track the data. Maybe I want to add a title. Okay, so I'll put in a title for the graph. I'll call it ABC Camera Company. There we go. And now I've got a title on the top of my graph. I could put in x-axis labels and y-axis labels. I could change the layout. Maybe I don't want this line graph. Maybe I want a 3D line. Okay, so we can jazz it up a little bit. Maybe I want a column graph. Maybe I don't want to look at a time series graph at all. Maybe I want to look year over year. But the main thing I'm trying to show here is that there's a great deal of flexibility in terms of my ability to customize the graphs, to customize the displays, to control pretty much everything about how things are reported. So I'm going to leave these settings where we are now, and let's talk about other things that we can do in our forecasting session. So we've begun by generating a forecast, looking at the graph and the report. Another thing that sometimes people do is they want to change the forecast. They might want to override the forecast. So we've got a very simple facility to do that. I've just moved to what we call the Override tab. You'll notice the little grid on the bottom. It shows the statistical forecast. There's a row to put in some overrides, and then it shows the final forecast. If I want, I can include the history. Okay, so now I've got the historic data, so when I'm making my adjustments, maybe I want to look at the history. And I can make changes various ways. Let's say for April, May, and June, I'm going to highlight those cells. We're going to run a promotion. I want to increase the forecast by 15%. So I'm going to use that spinner to specify 15%, click on the button, and you'll notice in red it's showing me the proposed changes. It's also showing it to me on the graph. And if I click on the commit button, then it will make the change. And so now I have a statistical forecast. That's what Forecast Pro generated. And I have an adjusted forecast, one that I've made some changes to. So one very common thing that you may need to do is to take the statistical forecast, treat it as a baseline, and make some adjustments to it before we finalize it. And we make it easy to do that. So in our very basic operations session here, we've generated a forecast, we've looked at graphs and reports, we've seen we can customize things, we've entered an override or two, and now it's time to save our work. And Forecast Pro will save your forecast out to Excel for you, and it does it in a couple of different ways. One thing you'll get is a workbook that has a worksheet for every item forecasted. So we're going to have a worksheet for iCamera and a worksheet for vCamera, and it will show the graph and it will show the report, and it will be the customized version of the graph and the report that you've specified. So if I have a 3D line graph and if I've got just the diagnostics that I want my manager to see, again, all of that will be preserved. The other thing we can do, and I'm going to open up a new tab here, and I'm going to say Display, Numeric Output. Numeric output is just the numbers, okay? So in addition to the tabs that are going to have the formatted reports, I'm also going to have a tab that shows this numeric information. And again, a recurring theme here in Forecast Pro, you can customize almost everything in Forecast Pro. So right now I have a very simple output. I'm just asking for the forecast. But maybe in addition to that, I want those upper confidence limits. So I'll turn that on, and you see a couple of rows with the confidence limits appear. Maybe in addition, I want to maintain those statistical forecasts. So I can compare the statistical forecast with the adjusted forecast. But as I click on some of these items, I'm just changing what's going to be saved out to Excel. And I can change the content. I can change the layout. You know, if I prefer this in columns, I click on that option and we can see it in columns. Or I can switch it back. And we can determine, do you want descriptions, do you want column headings? Again, what sort of precision do you want? Everything that you want to be able to specify, you can do. In addition to the forecasts, do you want any of the summary statistics? Okay, do you want any safety stock information? But again, the primary thing I'm trying to get across is you indicate what you want the output to contain. We'll show you a picture of what it's going to look like. And when you're happy, go ahead and save it. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. I'm going to click on this icon that looks like a little diskette, and it's going to save it out to Excel. I'll go ahead and hit save. And let's go into Excel and take a look at it. Okay, so here's Excel. I'm going to open up that file we just saved. Okay, here it is. Let me format this just a little bit. So this tab is the Numeric Output tab. And this is the one with the, again, the numeric information that we specified. We've got the forecast for camera, we've got the upper confidence limits, and the statistical forecast. The other two tabs are the graph and the formatted report. So here's the graph for the first one, the instant camera, and the report is underneath here. And the next tab is the variable format one. It also has its graph and its report. So basically, I've got all of this information now in Excel, and I can manipulate it any way I want in a very familiar to use environment, that is Excel. So at this point, I'm going to go back to our slides here. At this point, I've shown you really basic operations. We've read in some data from Excel. We let Forecast Pro generate a forecast using expert selection. We noted that we could make adjustments to it, and we saw that we can easily save out graphs, reports, and numeric information when we're satisfied that we have a good forecast.
Okay, yeah, just a couple questions so far. First, when using expert selection to pick the best model, why do you use the mean absolute deviation for the out-of-sample test as opposed to the mean absolute percent error?
Okay, good question. Basically, let's just take a very quick peek. So what he's saying is we do an out-of-sample test, and we're basing this on a unit error rather than a percentage error. The reason we're doing that is because we're only looking at one time series. The percent error can have scaling issues. So if I've got really low volume data, for instance, the percentage errors can get very large. So when we're only looking at a single time series, the unit error is a pretty good choice. When you go across series, there are other issues. But in the expert selection, because we know we're only dealing one series by one series, the unit error is appropriate.
Okay, and our other question is, can you add comments to forecast overrides?
Okay. The quick answer here is no, not in Forecast Pro XC. Forecast Pro XC is very much to generate a statistical forecast and then make sort of minimal changes to it. Our other products, which are designed more for routine operations, offer a much more flexible grid. You can make comments. You can have up to 10 override rows. You can have calculated rows, etc. But again, we're sort of, Forecast Pro XC is a desktop analysis tool. The emphasis is really on the analysis. And so the ability to enter overrides and sort of document them is somewhat limited, although you can save the overrides and restore them in later sessions. Okay, so let's go back to our product tour agenda. And we've taken a look at basic operations, and we're going to move on to our second topic here, which is custom modeling. Okay, so let's go back into Forecast Pro. And again, we've got a forecast here. We use the expert selection to define how to go about it. I'm going to open up another tab. So I'm going to click at the bottom here. I'm going to say Display Model Settings. So this is what we call the Model Settings tab. And basically, Forecast Pro has a wide array of different forecasting methodologies that are embedded in the program. Expert selection is the default. And so it will, if you don't give it any special instructions, it's going to use expert selection. But there are other methods here. Exponential smoothing models. There's 12 different exponential smoothing models in Forecast Pro. Box-Jenkins. We support a full multiplicative Box-Jenkins approach, and it can be done automatically or it can be done interactively. Moving averages. We've got very short data sets. Perhaps we want to use a moving average. We have some methods for low volume data. Discrete data models for small integer data. Intermittent demand data. So this is what the so-called Croston's intermittent model is supported. We have curve fitting routines. So if we want to fit a straight line through the data or we want to fit some other type of a curve, we can. We've got some very simple models. These are things like same as last year plus a percentage. Again, if we want to replicate some very simple things, we can. And we have some new product forecasting models here. There are also some models that aren't on the menu that are implemented in other ways. We'll talk about some of them, but they include promotional modeling for events. They also include regression modeling. But let's take a look, for instance, at Box-Jenkins. So this is our custom Box-Jenkins model, and wherever possible, even though we're not going to use expert selection, we're still going to give you some automatic options. So by setting this and saying, I want to use Box-Jenkins, so we're not going to do expert selection, it's not going to choose any method other than Box-Jenkins, but there is a question of what's the Box-Jenkins model going to look like. And in Box-Jenkins, you have to select what's called model orders, and this is the ARIMA 001010 is what the program came up with, and it did it automatically. But if I want to, I could say custom and choose a different model. So maybe I'd add an autoregressive term in here, and this would build a new model. Maybe I want to do some transforms, so I could do that. Notice there's a little thumbnail. So as you experiment, you can look at a thumbnail picture of the graph and the forecast, and it's doing this in real time. So as you change an option, it automatically changes it. So right now I've specified a custom Box-Jenkins model. If I go to the report, you'll notice on the report we no longer have expert selection. The model details say this is a user-defined ARIMA model. That's just another way of saying a user-defined Box-Jenkins model. And here's the form, and here's all the numbers that went into it. So if we want to call the shots, if we want to do specific models, it's very easy to do so. There are also, when appropriate, you have access to what we call Advanced Diagnostics. So I'm going to open yet another tab, the Advanced Diagnostics tab. This is really for the analysts out there, the people who are familiar with forecasting methodologies and want to get pretty detailed. But we allow you to look at advanced diagnostic displays. So what you're viewing now is called the error autocorrelation function, and it's often used when diagnosing Box-Jenkins models, which is why I brought it up. There are other displays here, though. If I just want to look at the errors month by month, so these are the residuals, I could do that, and I could scroll through this display and view the errors. The autocorrelation function and the partial autocorrelation function. These are diagnostic tools that help us with things like differencing in Box-Jenkins models. But the main point is to just point out that there are some advanced diagnostics. They're tucked away, so if you don't want to look at them, you don't have to. But if you're doing, say you're teaching classes on forecasting, we have a lot of people using this package in academia, you can have the students look at these displays and you can explain manual identification modeling for Box-Jenkins and other methods. If you're doing regression, there are things like correlation matrices and covariance matrices. So again, even though Forecast Pro can be highly automatic and it has a lot of built-in intelligence about being able to build models automatically, it also provides a very comprehensive set of statistics and diagnostic output for those who really want to get into the details. But let's go back to our model settings, and as I mentioned, what this allows us to do is to go through 4 different methods. We looked at Box-Jenkins. Let me do curve fitting, for instance, and choose different types of curves. So if I just want to put a straight line through the data, maybe I'll add the fitted values there, or a quadratic curve. I can sit here and change things to my heart's content. But again, a lot of our users are using expert selection, and it does an awfully good job if we're going to be generating forecasts based solely on the past history. If we want to do promotional modeling, if we want to do regression approaches with explanatory variables, then that requires more effort. But again, I managed to turn off my forecast, so I think I'll turn those back on. I meant to turn off our fitted values. Again, if I want to get an automatically generated baseline forecast, that's a very simple and straightforward operation in Forecast Pro. Okay, so we've taken a look at custom modeling. Do we have any questions at this point?
Yeah, a couple more questions. First, can you see the details at the product family level?
Okay, that's a good question. It's actually a pretty good segue into bullet number 3 on the screen. So the next thing we're going to look at is actually working with what we call it a data hierarchy. So I might have group level data and then item level data as well. So I'm going to defer that question just for a moment. We'll see that yes, you can see the results at all levels. You can also dictate the modeling options at all levels. You can also make adjustments at all levels. So again, we'll show that live in just a minute. Is there other questions at the moment?
Fair enough. Yeah. One more question. How would you compare the results of one model with that chosen by expert selection to get the best model?
Okay. I guess the answer I would say there is, again, expert selection takes a certain approach, and it's based on the properties of the data, and it's based on some out-of-sample testing. And I think my response would fall into this category, which is if I were going to base which method to choose based solely on the data itself, then it's going to be hard to outperform expert selection, because that's really what expert selection is doing. The exception to that would be if I have short data sets, where automatic methods don't tend to work real well with short data sets. There, your knowledge of the data might lead you to try alternative models. In terms of the comparing and contrasting, you can look at the data fit. If your data is long enough, you can do a holdout sample, and Forecast Pro does allow you to do that. There is this, we're not going to show it explicitly in this demonstration, but there is a holdout analysis which allows you to withhold parts of the data and to test different methods, and that's probably the best way to compare and contrast different models. Okay, so on to our next topic, which is working with a data hierarchy. And along the way, we'll illustrate the question that was first posed just a moment ago. So I'm going to start up a new little session here, and I'm going to open some different data. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a spreadsheet, and I'm going to read in this data. And I'm going to make a change to our navigator here. And let's consider what we're looking at. I just opened up a spreadsheet. It has data for a company. It's basically a bakery, and it has different. It makes different baked goods, and the two products categories that it has is muffins. Okay, so now we're looking at sales of muffins and cakes. So I've got sales of muffins and cakes. If I drill down in the navigator, you'll see that underneath that we have customer level data. So Stuff Mart, Sid's Club, Groceryland, Food King. If I drill down in one of our customers, I get to yet another level, which is the SKU, or the individual stock keeping unit. So we have 4 different levels. Our lowest level is the SKU. So this is things like corn muffins in a certain size package. The next level up is the customer, then the product category, muffins and cakes, and then finally total sales. So this hierarchy allows me to look at the data at any of these levels. And I'm going to fully expand the navigator. And you can see for this example, I've got about 60 or 70 different items which I'm forecasting. Okay. Now, you can manipulate the forecast in a similar fashion to what I showed you earlier. That is, I can do custom modeling for any item that I want. I can also do adjustments at any level. So if I go into the overrides here, I'm currently at a customer level, and let's say I make a change. So here we are, 1.441 million units for September. Let's change that to 1.5 million. Okay, and let's go ahead and commit to that. And if I change this forecast, the little red icon tells me that there's a change there. There's an override. Notice that that would also change the forecast for September for muffins and for bakery, because the customer level is a subset of that. It would also make adjustments, proportional adjustments, to the items underneath it. So the main thing I want to show here is that you can make adjustments to any level of the hierarchy, and the whole hierarchy will adjust accordingly. Another consideration, for those of you who've worked with data like this, you've probably heard of phrases like top-down forecasting or middle-out forecasting or bottom-up forecasting. And it refers to where are the forecasts generated and how do we get from level to level and make sure that everything reconciles. The default in Forecast Pro is a bottom-up approach where the end items are all forecasted individually and all the group level forecasts are aggregations. But if I wanted to change that, let's say I want to forecast total sales for all muffins and then allocate them downwards, I can do that very easily by adding what we call a top-down flag. So I'm going to put one on there. You can see it right here on the navigator. And that's indicating that for the muffins level, I want to forecast, create a forecast for muffins and allocate it downwards. So we actually have an archive full of pre-recorded educational webinars. There's an entire webinar on forecasting a product hierarchy. If you do want to learn more about multiple level forecasting or actually any of the methods that I've been showing you today, go to our archived webinar page, and there's a lot of really good information there if you want to learn more. But my purpose here is not to teach you about multiple level forecasting. It's really just to illustrate that manipulating a hierarchy in Forecast Pro XC is very easy to set one up. It's very easy to look at the data and forecast at different levels and to use any combination of top-down or bottom-up approaches that you wish. So let's go back to our slide set here, and we're coming towards our final module here, which is regression. Before we do so, are there any questions?
Just one quick question, not necessarily specifically to hierarchies, but the question is, does Forecast Pro Unlimited forecast more than 100 items, and what is the upper limit of its capabilities?
Okay. Forecast Pro Unlimited and Forecast Pro Track are both designed for large-scale forecasting. There are no hard and fast limits. So we've done surveys. Typically, users of those products are forecasting anywhere from about 500 to 20,000 end items. They really are different products. They have different interfaces. When you're forecasting, one item at a time, it's a very different operation than forecasting, say, 50,000 different part numbers on a weekly basis. So there are no hard and fast limitations. Obviously, as you start to use lots of data, things like powerful hardware become important. But again, I would say if you're forecasting less than 100,000 items, you're in fine ground. If you're going more than that, we have customers who do it, but you may want to make sure you've got a super fast machine with lots of memory. But if you have specific questions, give us a call and we'll be happy to answer it. Okay, so let's continue on. Our last module here is dynamic regression, and let me give you a flavor for how that works. I'm going to again close down our current one, and I'm going to pull down this drop-down box, and I want you to notice there's kind of two modes in Forecast Pro XC. Expert selection mode, which is what we've been using, where we're saying by default we're going to build expert selection forecast, and regression. And regression operates a little differently than time series methods, and we have an awful lot of people. It's kind of funny. We have a lot of Forecast Pro XE users who never use regression, ever. They simply do the forecasting using the time series methods. We also have a fair number of XE users who only use regression because they're in industries where that's the method of choice. And the number who use both is small. And that's why I want to spend some time looking at regression here. But again, it's a very nice implementation of regression, and we'll show you how it works. So what I'm going to do now is to read in some data. And the example for regression is actually sales of electricity. Okay, so the data come from a power company. And for those who are familiar with regression, you'll follow along with some of the terminology. I know that some of us that are attending today are probably not familiar with regression, so some of these words may be new to you, but I'll do my best to explain what we're doing as we go along. We're going to list our first variable on the script, and it is assumed to be the dependent variable, that is the one we're forecasting. And I'm also going to list a bunch of explanatory variables or independent variables. So I'm going to forecast sales of electricity, and the variables that are going to help me are basically temperature data, things like heating and cooling degree days. But it's basically saying when it's hot out, people sell more electricity because people are running air conditioning. When it's real cold, you've got heating as well. So temperature variables tend to be very important for residential electric power forecasting. We also have things like air conditioning saturation rates, disposable income. I'm going to include them but actually turn them off. And I'm also going to include what's called a constant term. But basically, when building a regression model, you list the variables that you want to include in the model. And if you list some variables but don't include them, then we can also test for their inclusion later. But I'm going to start this simple example with, again, forecasting sales of electricity based on temperature. And I'm going to click OK, and it builds a regression model. So here we have sales of electricity. Here we have the forecast. Our explanatory variables are here, heating and cooling degree days. And we have a constant term. And notice the output in our report. So here's our regression model. We've got the coefficients in the model, their standard errors, the t-statistics, everything we need. I'm going to put on the fitted values. And electric power, you can forecast highly accurately using regression. And even this very simple model, we're doing a pretty good job. Regression is an iterative process where we really try a potential model and then make changes based on our interpretation of the current model. Forecast Pro includes not only things like t-statistics and coefficients and within sample statistics, but it also has some specialized test batteries for regression. So these are hypothesis tests, and they're basically ways of determining what to add or not add to the model. So this first test is this variable specification test. It's looking at things like the air conditioning saturation and the disposable income and a trend term. And you can see at the bottom it says try adding a trend to the model. So that's a recommendation of one way to improve the model. Below that, we have what we call the dynamics tests. So these are looking for things, basically time series elements, lags of the dependent variable, and Cochrane-Orcutt terms. And we can see that we have a recommendation. Try adding auto -1 to the model. This is a so-called Cochrane-Orcutt term, and it will help us explain some of the variation in the data. So I've built a model. I can look at the diagnostics. Under advanced diagnostics, as I mentioned before, we can look at things like the error autocorrelation function. We can see a lot of patterning there. We can look at the correlation matrix for our variables. We can look at the covariance matrix. We can look at our diagnostic tests. And when we want to make a change, I'm going to click here, I could add something to the model. So our automatic recommendations of trend and auto 1 are here. The other things we tested for I could add. Okay. Or I could go to the script and add anything I want. But I'm going to add an auto -1. And this automatically updates the model. So this is now a new model. And we can see it has an auto -1 in it. This is the Cochrane-Orcutt term. It's highly significant. And we've improved the model. And we can then look for this model, look at our diagnostics, see how they've changed. Maybe look at the error autocorrelation function. This is cleaned up a bit. You might notice there's a little bit of a cyclical pattern here, so there's a little seasonality left here. And then make a change. It's saying try adding auto -12. That's in creating a seasonal Cochrane-Orcutt approach. That's reasonable. We saw some seasonal patterning, and maybe I'd go ahead and add that. And now we're getting just a very good model. We're just fitting the data like a glove. But the main point here is not to generate the best model we can for sales of electricity. It's to give you a feel for regression modeling in Forecast Pro XC. And what I hope I've conveyed here is it's a very simple, straightforward operation. It's very easy to build a model, make changes to it, to add and remove different terms. There's a lot of diagnostics to guide you through the process. And if you've done model building in Excel or in SAS or SPSS or programs like that, you'll know that it's relatively cumbersome. To try different models and set them up and interpret them, it takes some time and effort. Here it's really click, click, click. So it's, again, a very nice implementation of regression that's very accessible. You really can kind of pick it up and use it in a very immediate way. Okay, so that is our last module and sort of the demonstration front. Do we have questions on the regression front?
We just have one last question, Eric.
Okay.
Which is, how does one know if regression is applicable to one's industry?
Okay. I would say there are certain industries where it's just absolutely known in the industry. So the example I used, electric power. If you work for an electric power company, you basically know that almost all residential models are built using regression because the weather is so important. When you get into other industries, I would say a couple of things. One is, how has your company been doing it historically? Do you have any leading indicators? Are there important explanatory variables, particularly if they run ahead of what you're going to forecast? So if I'm in a company that does, say, building materials for construction, then maybe I look at housing starts data. That would be pretty common. So I would say probably the best way to try to find out if it's applicable for your industry is to start asking around. You know, if you're at a forecasting trade show with other people in your industry, ask people how they go about it. There are certainly some industries where people have tried it because they've thought of different variables that might be important. And it's been, again, if you don't know it's appropriate for your industry, I guess it's a trial and error approach. Again, I'll sort of also refer you to our pre-recorded webinars that are on forecastpro.com. There are webinars on dynamic regression modeling, and it will go into much more depth than the demonstration will. Okay, so let's now, we'll sort of say a few things in closing. If you do have additional questions, you can go ahead and send them in to Eric Sabatis. We might take one or two more before we sign off. One of the things I want to mention is there's a lot of functionality which we didn't cover in a 45-minute demonstration. So some of the things we didn't show: event modeling, which are promotional approaches, forecasting approaches to modeling promotions and business interruptions. New product forecasting. Forecast Pro XE supports the BAS model, which is a diffusion model. It also supports something called forecasting by analogy, which lets you base a new product's forecast on a profile or history of a different item. We support outlier detection and correction, where we can automatically look through the data and detect unusual data points, and if you want, even go ahead and correct them prior to forecasting. Out-of-sample testing, I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. So there's a lot of functionality which I didn't show today, but what I tried to hit is some of the highlights and to give you a feel for sort of the ease of use, and I hope I've accomplished that.